They called me overdramatic. Right there, outside my son's ICU room, while he was coding. I still remember the way the coffee smelled. Burnt. Bitter. A nurse's cup left forgotten on the counter next to the crash cart. Brad's voice came through the glass. Calm. Detached. She's just spiraling again. Don't let her take control. And then, his mother, Margaret, added, if she makes a scene, we can use that. They weren't whispering. They didn't care that I could hear. I had just come out of the restroom. My hands were still damp, and in that moment, I wasn't a mother whose child had just flatlined. I was a liability. A pawn in their power game. Ethan was 10. He liked grilled cheese and Star Wars and still called me Mommy when he was scared. But to them, he was a medical bill, and I was the woman in the way. I didn't speak. Didn't scream. I just turned back toward the hallway, past the vending machines that always jammed, past the pale green walls that hadn't changed since I interned here 15 years ago. I walked back into Ethan's room and sat beside his bed. The beeping was steadier now, mechanical, indifferent. He was breathing again. Barely. I brushed the hair off his forehead. You don't have to hear what they said, baby, I whispered. But I did. From my bag, I pulled out a folded navy folder. I'd been carrying it for months, just in case. Inside, power of attorney paperwork, medical proxy transfer forms, a notarized affidavit, and a flash drive with voice recordings. Margaret's voice from a month ago. She's emotional. That's all she ever is. Chelsea, Brad's sister. She's exhausting. Let Brad take over before she loses it. I had filed everything. Documented every dismissal, every undermining move. I thought I was crazy for preparing all this. But now, I felt nothing but calm. They tried to erase me. But I knew where the ink bled, and I was done pretending this was still a family. So I zipped the folder shut, leaned back, and watched my son breathe. They thought I was weak because I cried. Because I begged once. Because I stayed silent. But they forgot what silence can carry. Would you fight back, or walk away quietly? And if it were your child, would silence still be strength? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever tried to write you out of your own story? The room hadn't changed in hours. Still cold. Still humming. Still filled with that sterile silence hospitals never apologize for. Ethan's fingers were curled around the edge of his blanket. The same one I'd packed the night before. The soft blue one with stitched rockets he used since preschool. I hadn't left his side. Not once. My back ached. Not from the hospital cot, but from years of carrying the weight of parenting alone. I looked around the ICU room. The whiteboard still said, Jessica, Mom RN, okayed. That was my handwriting. I'd written it myself when the night nurse forgot. The monitors blinked softly. O2 sat at 89. Not great, but he was here. Brad hadn't called, not once. The last time I saw him, 3 months ago, was at his girlfriend's baby shower. He told Ethan he'd drop by next week. He never did. We shared custody on paper, but not in life. He liked the title, Dad, more than the job. His mother, Margaret, texted Ethan on birthdays. Generic emojis. Sometimes a gift card to a place he didn't like. She'd unfollowed me a year after the divorce. I didn't care. Until last month, when Ethan collapsed at school and they started showing up again. Unannounced. Uninvited. Suddenly interested. Suddenly involved. Not with help, but with opinions. Maybe you're overreacting, Margaret said when I mentioned the cardiology consult. Kids fake symptoms sometimes for attention. Chelsea added, without looking up from her phone. They didn't ask what tetralogy of Fallot meant. Didn't read the handouts I left on the kitchen counter. They just rolled their eyes. I stopped explaining. The first time Ethan had surgery, age 4, I slept on the floor beside his crib. Brad had been in Vegas. Business trip, he said. He brought back a keychain. I kept that keychain in my drawer for years. Not because I missed him, but because it reminded me not to forget. I poured another cup of coffee from the family lounge. Lukewarm. Tasted like cardboard. I didn't flinch. Back in Ethan's room, a new nurse checked the IV line. "You've been here all night?" she asked, surprised. "3 nights," I replied. She blinked. "That explains the chart." I nodded. Didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. My name was on every line of the care notes. Initials in blue ink. Double underlines next to med changes. I wasn't just Ethan's mom. I was the one who knew how his heart skipped on caffeine. The one who noticed when his fingertips turned dusky before the pulse ox caught it. But in the eyes of that family, I was still the girl Brad married on impulse, still the nurse, not a doctor, still too soft. Too much. I looked at my phone. Group chat, the Morgans, still active. I scrolled. Chelsea. Is she doing that thing again? Margaret. Hysterical. Hospital always makes her act out. Brad. We'll stop by when things settle. No need to indulge the drama. I stared at the screen. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than Ethan's monitor. Not because I was surprised, but because I had read it before. They had always seen me this way. Even when I saved their son. Even when I gave up night shifts to take Ethan to speech therapy. Even when I stayed in a job that barely covered his insurance because it let me keep flexible hours. To them, I was just emotional. Too attached, Brad once said during mediation. Obsessive. Margaret called me that too. I was never enough. Until now, when control became currency. I closed the phone and picked up Ethan's favorite toy. A plastic spaceship we'd bought at the museum last summer. He loved the gift shop more than the exhibit. I wiped a smudge off its wing. Held it in my palm like a secret. There were no photos of his father in this room. No cards from Margaret. Only the crayon drawing Ethan had taped to the cabinet 2 days ago, a heart with a lightning bolt through it. His name under mine. Just the two of us. The doctor returned at noon. He was young. Nervous. Spoke in clipped phrases. Stable. But critical. Next 24 hours matter. I asked questions. Wrote notes. Reviewed the chart. Signed. Stayed. And when he left, I whispered to Ethan. "You're not alone, baby. No matter what they say." He stirred. Lashes fluttering. Just enough for me to believe he heard. The hallway filled again with voices. Brad's this time. Louder. He was here. But not for Ethan. Not really. I knew that walk. I knew that tone. And in my chest, beneath the ache and the fear and the burn of betrayal, something steadier took root. Resolve. I didn't speak when Brad walked in. Didn't stand. Didn't look up from Ethan's chart. But I heard everything. The shoes. The fake sigh. The pause at the door before he said, "Hey." Like we were old coworkers running into each other by accident. I looked at the IV pump instead. The rate was low. We were conserving fluids. Ethan's breathing had steadied, but his color still worried me. I scribbled a note. Adjusted the blanket. Brad cleared his throat. "How's he doing?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't trust my voice not to break. Then I heard it. Behind him. Margaret's voice. "Oh good, she's here. Let's make this quick." She swept into the room like she owned the floor. Chelsea trailed after, holding a designer purse too large for a hospital visit. I stood. Not in welcome. Just to put myself between them and the bed. "Ethan's stable," I said flatly. "The team's working on managing his oxygen levels." Margaret clucked. "Well, thank God someone's doing something." Chelsea smirked. "We were worried you'd be too caught up again." Her eyes flicked to the blanket. to my coffee cup, to the way I stood, always taking inventory. Brad stayed silent. His gaze dropped to the floor. Coward. I turned to the nurse standing near the sink. Could you give us a moment? The nurse hesitated, looked at me, then them, then back at me. Then she nodded and stepped out. Margaret sat. Didn't ask, didn't wait. We need to revisit Ethan's care plan, she said. I've spoken with Brad. Given the emotional strain you're clearly under. She glanced pointedly at the chair I'd been living in. We think it's best to transfer decision-making to someone more neutral. Neutral. She meant Brad. She meant herself. I laughed once. Quiet. No one joined me. I reached into my bag. Pulled out a worn envelope. Laid out the paperwork this morning, I said. Already filed with the hospital. Chelsea leaned forward. What paperwork? Updated medical proxy. Emergency guardianship. Affidavit of continuous care. I met Brad's eyes. You never rescinded yours, remember? Since the divorce. It was still on file. He blinked, like I'd just spoken a different language. Which means, I continued. You were still legally listed as primary. Even though I've been the only one attending appointments, managing meds, making every decision for the last 7 years. Brad opened his mouth. Margaret cut him off. We're just concerned about Ethan's well-being. You've been volatile. They always used that word when a woman didn't fold. I stepped closer to the bed. Ethan stirred slightly, one hand twitching under the blanket. I'm his mother, I said. The one who has slept on floors and missed shifts and fought insurance battles. The one who notices when his lips go gray before the pulse ox screams. Chelsea rolled her eyes. Margaret stood. You're tired, Jessica. That's all. We're stepping in because we care. I didn't argue. Didn't shout. Just pulled the second document from the envelope, the one with timestamps. The one signed by Dr. Lena Cho and nurse manager Andrews. Documenting every night I was present. Every shift Brad skipped. Every note Margaret never signed. I'm filing for full medical guardianship, I said calmly. It'll take 48 hours, but until then, this holds. Margaret's mouth twisted. You can't just. I can, I said. And I did. Brad finally spoke. You're being unreasonable. I looked at him then. Really looked. The lines near his eyes had deepened. But not from grief. From distance. He hadn't asked what Ethan's latest test results showed. He hadn't touched his son's hand. He hadn't even looked at him. He wasn't here for Ethan. He was here for control. They all were. Margaret stepped closer. You're not the only one who loves him. But I'm the only one who stayed. The room went still. No one breathed. Then Ethan whimpered in his sleep. I turned back to him. They left without another word. I stood for a long time after the door clicked shut, fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of having finally said the truth out loud. Outside, the hallway smelled of lemon polish and reheated soup. I walked to the vending machine. Got nothing. Typical. Back in the room, the folded spaceship drawing caught my eye again. Ethan and me, holding hands, drawn in thick blue crayon. 2 stick figures. No third. I sat down beside his bed. Ran my fingers along the seams of the blanket. The same one he cried into during his first IV. The same one Margaret once called too childish. A nurse entered quietly. Vitals holding steady. She whispered. She paused, then added, I heard what happened. Just so you know, we see you. I nodded once. Couldn't speak. But in that moment something steadier returned. Not strength, not yet, but proof. That I wasn't invisible. Not here, not anymore. The next morning started like all the others. Fluorescent lights, cold coffee, and the sound of machines trying to mimic life. But something had shifted. The air in the ICU felt thinner, like it had been cleared of whatever storm they tried to drag in with them. I brushed Ethan's hair back, still soft despite the hospital air, and whispered, "They're not touching this. Not today." I stepped out to talk to Dr. Cho. A quick update, quick questions. She was warm, sharp, and knew the difference between a worried mother and a woman being pushed aside. As I walked back toward the room, a nurse stopped me. "Sorry, Mom. We're limiting access until the shift change. Visitor policy." I blinked. "But I'm not a visitor." She looked again at the tablet in her hand. I understand," she said, nervous. "But the chart lists Mr. Morgan as the legal proxy. It was confirmed earlier this morning." My blood ran cold. I already filed updated documentation. It was time-stamped yesterday. Approved by administration. She hesitated. "I'm just following the record here." Her eyes darted down. "Someone came in earlier. Said she was the grandmother. Asked to clarify medical access." I didn't need to ask. "Margaret." The nurse nodded. She also signed a note. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I moved past her, opened the door to Ethan's room. He was still there. Breathing. But his chart had been moved. His vitals were annotated in different handwriting. The medication record had an adjustment, a highlighted line, and a new signature. Margaret E. Morgan. In blue ink, I stood frozen. I felt like the floor tilted beneath me. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a quiet erasure. I picked up the chart, flipped to the order page. They'd tried to change his antibiotic. Nothing dangerous, but enough to create confusion. Enough to take the wheel out of my hands. I stepped back into the hallway. My fingers dialed automatically. The number I hadn't used in 2 years. Adams and Hunt Law Office. The voice answered. "This is Jessica Morgan. I need to speak with Julia Hunt." Pause. "I have a case of medical overreach and potential custody interference. At St. Joseph's ICU." 20 minutes later, Julia met me at the hospital cafe. Hair in a tight bun, coat still warm from the morning cold. She didn't waste time. "Tell me everything." I handed her the folder. Then the printed screenshots. Then the text messages. Then the hospital documents I had filed. She flipped through in silence. Then said, "They're building a case." Slowly, strategically. Probably to re-establish full custody. "They think I'm fragile," I said. "They think if they paint me unstable, I'll fade out quietly." Julia didn't smile. Didn't flinch. She just nodded. "Let's make that the last assumption they ever get to make." We walked straight to hospital administration. Filed every document. Flagged Ethan's profile for legal alert. Requested a proxy override review with risk management. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was solid. Bulletproof. I returned to Ethan's room just before noon. Brad was sitting there. Feet crossed. Phone in hand. Looking like he'd just completed a task, not visited his child. He didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge me. But I saw the email he had open. Subject: custody case. Grounds for emotional instability. He was copying a family lawyer. My throat tightened. But I didn't show it. Not anymore. I walked to the other side of the bed. Checked the IV. Tucked the blanket. Brushed Ethan's cheek. Brad finally looked up. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't answer. Just opened the drawer where I kept Ethan's notebook. He loved drawing in it. A sketch of our dog. A rocket. A heart with initials. He flipped to a page I hadn't seen before. 2 stick figures. One small, one taller. No names. But the bigger figure had long hair. I traced it with my finger. "You think I'll fold?" I said softly. "You think if you pile enough on top, I'll collapse under it?" Brad stood. His expression unreadable. No one's trying to hurt you. That's exactly the problem, I said. You think hurting me is a byproduct, not the intention. But it's been the method all along. He looked away. I've been patient, Jessica? No, I said. You've been strategic, cold, passive until it suited you to move. I pulled out my phone. Opened the voice memo from yesterday morning. Margaret's voice. If she makes a scene, we can use that. Brad didn't blink, but his jaw tightened. I'll see you in court, I said. He left the room without another word. I stood still, letting the silence settle. The machines beeped. Ethan breathed. And outside, the wind rattled the pane. That afternoon, Julia filed the first motion emergency petition for exclusive medical guardianship. The hospital acknowledged it by 4 p.m., and security was notified to block any access not explicitly cleared. By evening, a nurse taped a new sign on Ethan's door. Authorized access Jessica Morgan only. I stared at it for a long time, not because I doubted it, but because it was the first time I felt seen on paper. Real. Documented. Unshakable. I looked down at my son. His chest rose slowly, rhythm steady. He didn't know what had just happened. But one day, he would. And when he asked who fought for him, who didn't flinch, didn't fold, I'd have the receipts. I found the iPad by accident. It was still linked to our old shared cloud, buried in a tote bag Brad had left in the lounge. I didn't snoop. I just needed to print an insurance form. I opened the browser, tapped the mail icon, and there it was. A group chat. 4 names. Brad, Margaret, Chelsea, and a contact labeled, Counsel EM. The last message hadn't even been locked. Still glowing on the screen. Chelsea. She's unraveling. Just keep her distracted until we finalize. Margaret. She's too emotional to see what's happening. That's our advantage. Brad. She thinks she's winning. Let her. My hand went cold. But I didn't move. I didn't even blink. They were planning it. Together. Calmly. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. A blueprint to erase me piece by piece. I sat down on the arm of the chair. The iPad still open in my lap. And for the first time since the night Ethan was rushed into the ER, I let myself cry. Not loudly. Not violently. Just quietly. The kind of tears that don't ask for attention. The kind you only shed when you know there's no one coming to rescue you. My world hadn't shattered. It had eroded slowly. And now, the walls I thought were just cracked. They weren't walls anymore. I reached for the navy folder still zipped in my purse, pulled out the copy of the legal motion Julia had filed, held it like a lifeline. Because that's what it was. Back in Ethan's room, a nurse was adjusting his lines. She looked up when I entered. "Hey, asked for you," she said softly. I walked to his side, sat gently. His fingers twitched as I brushed them. "Hey, baby," I whispered. "I'm here?" "Still here." His eyes fluttered. Didn't open fully, but I saw the recognition. He squeezed my hand, and that was enough. Enough to keep breathing. Enough to keep filing. Enough to keep fighting. Later that night, while Ethan slept, I took the iPad back to my temporary apartment. The space was small, just a short-term rental 5 blocks from the hospital. 1 bed. A table with 2 chairs. A window that overlooked nothing. I plugged in the iPad and downloaded everything. Screenshots. Audio notes. Every receipt of their betrayal. I printed them in batches, stacked them in order. Dated. Labeled. Bound with a black clip. Then I placed them next to Ethan's heart monitor discharge papers. Next to the ER intake from last week with my signature. Next to every note with my name as primary caregiver. This wasn't just documentation. This was a story. The story they didn't think I'd be brave enough to tell. The next morning, I handed everything to Julia. She didn't ask why I printed so much. She didn't tell me to calm down. She just looked me in the eye and said, "They underestimated you." That was their first mistake. Back at the hospital, no one looked me in the eye. Not the staff who'd listened to Margaret, not the administrator who'd signed off on the old proxy. Only one nurse did. Older, gray around the temples. Kind eyes, she said. "I remember your first night here. You didn't even sit. You just stood by his bed the whole time." I nodded. Didn't cry this time. Because her words. They were proof. Memory as testimony. That night, after another round of labs and another delayed echo, I took Ethan's hand again. His eyes opened fully for the first time in days. "Mum," he croaked. Just one word. But it shattered something in me. I leaned close. "I'm here. You're okay." He closed his eyes again. But the tension in his face eased. Like he knew, finally, that I hadn't left. The room dimmed for the night. Curtains drawn. Machines humming. I lay back in the reclining chair, folded the blanket I kept just for him, and stared at the ceiling. Everything hurt. Not physically, but in that deep place where disappointment meets exhaustion. I thought of all the dinners I'd eaten standing up. All the forms I'd signed alone, all the times I'd walked out of a clinic with a diagnosis in one hand and no one to hold the other. Brad was never there. Margaret never called. Chelsea only posted Instagram photos of her dog, and yet now they wanted Ethan's story to belong to them. To write me out. But I had the ink, I had the paper, I had the time. And now, I had the rage, quiet, precise, legal. The kind of rage they never see coming, because it doesn't raise its voice. It just waits. Then speaks in documents and courtrooms and security clearances. And justice. Without apology, the courthouse smelled like dust and lemon floor polish. Not a poetic metaphor. Just truth. Old air, tired sunlight, and quiet determination. I hadn't been here in years. Not since the divorce hearing. Not since I sat on a bench outside courtroom 3A and promised myself I'd never end up in this position again. Pleading for something already mine, but here I was. Not pleading, not begging, filing. Julia walked beside me, heels tapping a steady rhythm. In her arms, a thick binder marked, "Morgan Emergency Petition." In mine, Ethan's drawing. The blue crayon sketch of two stick figures. That morning, before I left the apartment, I'd folded it carefully. Not for evidence, but for grounding. We filed the petition by 10:03 a.m. Stamped. Log. Confirmed. Julia spoke to the clerk like they were old friends. Which, it turned out, they were. The court date was expedited. Not weeks. Days. This Sunday. That gave us 4 days. 4 days to prepare a case I'd been silently building for almost a year. Back in the hospital, I didn't speak much. Didn't tell Brad. Didn't tell the nurses. I just stayed close. Watched vitals. Documented everything. Every shift change, every visitor, every moment Margaret tried to clarify her access. I collected it all. The folder in my bag grew heavier. Not with paper. With proof. I updated a spreadsheet I'd started 7 months ago. After Ethan's first major cardiology flare. I logged dosage times, missed visits, text delays. I listed every message that started with, "Sorry, I forgot," and ended with, "Next time, I promise." I had timelines, screenshots, medical bills, statements, nurse notations, and every moment someone called me. Emotional. Margaret came in the next evening. Unannounced. Brad trailing behind her. She didn't even say hello. She stood by Ethan's bed like it belonged to her. Touched the blanket like it was a prop. "You know, you don't have to do this alone," she said. Her voice was syrupy. I looked up. "I'm not alone." Brad stayed near the door. Hands in pockets. Avoiding eye contact. She stepped closer. "You've always been intense, Jessica. It's one of the reasons things didn't work out. But I know you love him. I said nothing. She smiled. Which is why you'll understand that if this gets worse, we might need to make hard decisions. Financially, medically. Brad finally spoke. We're just saying. Maybe guardianship shouldn't be a battlefield. I stared at him. At what point did you become interested in guardianship? He blinked. Didn't answer. Because if you cared when it mattered, none of this would be happening. They left without arguing. Which was worse. Because silence from them meant planning. Not peace. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. You can still walk away from this without it getting ugly? No name. But I didn't need one. The sentence reeked of Margaret. I saved the number. Then forwarded the message to Julia. No reply from her. Just a check mark. She was already documenting it. 2 nights before the court date, I stayed at the hospital until 2 a.m. Then walked back to the apartment in silence. Salt Lake City at night is colder than it should be. Dry, clear, unforgiving. I passed 3 empty coffee shops, 2 bus stops, and 1 woman arguing with a man over a phone charger. The world kept spinning, even as mine rewrote itself. At the apartment, I opened my laptop, typed a name into the search bar. Still standing. Org. I had bought the domain last year. Back when I thought I was starting something for other women. Turns out, I was building it for myself. That night, I rewrote the landing page. For mothers who stayed. Even when no one else did. No launch yet, just a sentence. Just intention. At 4:17 a.m., I finally slept. 2 hours later, I was back at the hospital. Ethan's vitals held steady. His oxygen climbed. The nurse smiled when I arrived. Hey, asked for you again. I sat beside him. His voice was faint, but it found me. Mum. I'm here. I whispered. I'm always here. He squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. Would you fight for your voice? Or let them speak for you? Have you ever been erased? Slowly, quietly. By the people who claim to care. Tell me where you're listening from. Your story matters too. Sunday morning. The courthouse doors hissed shut behind me like a warning. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I carried Ethan's pink blanket under one arm. Not for court, for grounding, for memory. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was too beige, too quiet, too cold. I arrived early. But I didn't sit. I stood by the window, folder in hand, pressed my fingers against its edge until the cardboard left lines on my skin. They were already inside when I entered. Margaret in navy, Brad in charcoal gray, Chelsea trailing behind like an accessory. They didn't look at me, but they looked polished, practiced, confident. Margaret whispered something to Brad, who nodded once. His lawyer smoothed her skirt and approached the clerk with a smirk. They thought it was over. They were wrong. Julia walked in exactly on the hour. Hair pulled back, heels silent. She didn't greet them. She didn't need to. She handed our packet to the judge's assistant, then whispered, "Sit still. Let the truth do the work." The judge entered. Silver hair, expression unreadable. He didn't smile. Didn't greet us. Just flipped open the folder and began reading. Brad's attorney spoke first. All calm tones and weaponized concern. Your Honor, we believe the mother has acted emotionally, irrationally, and with clear instability throughout this hospitalization. Our goal is not to remove her, but to support Ethan through a more balanced structure of care. Julia stood slowly. Didn't pace. Didn't blink. She handed the clerk a USB drive and nodded toward the screen. The courtroom TV lit up. There they were. Brad's own words. Margaret's too. If she makes a scene, we can use it. She's unraveling. She won't last under pressure. Then Julia submitted the nurse affidavits, the signed proxy override, the timestamps, the hospital logs showing my 83 consecutive hours at Ethan's bedside. I didn't move, just looked at the judge. He cleared his throat. You've submitted over 250 pages of documentation, he said to Julia. Yes, Your Honor, but most importantly, her name was always on the forms. The only error was that no one read them. The room held its breath. Brad shifted in his chair. Margaret looked pale. Then the judge closed the folder. Motion for exclusive medical guardianship is granted, effective immediately. Brad stood. Your Honor. You will sit, the judge interrupted. And listen carefully. Any attempt to interfere with this order will be considered contempt of court. Chelsea gasped. Margaret reached for her pearls. But I didn't move, because this wasn't revenge. This was return, to truth, to motherhood, to my name on the form. When we stepped outside, Julia handed me the official copy. I stared at it for a long time. Then I whispered, finally. Later that afternoon, I returned to the hospital. The night nurse greeted me with a smile. He's been resting well, she said. Even asked for that blanket. I handed it over, watched her tuck it around Ethan's legs. He stirred slightly, then sighed. Peaceful. Brad didn't show up that day. Neither did Margaret. Or Chelsea. No calls, no flowers, no more games. It was quiet, and in that quiet, I began. I sat in the hospital lounge and opened my laptop. Logged in to Still Standing. Org. Uploaded the first article. When they try to take your name off the form. I didn't use their names, didn't share the recordings. Just wrote the truth. Then I clicked, publish. Not for them. For every woman who sat in that same chair and wondered if anyone would believe her. 2 hours later, the first email arrived. Subject. Thank you. I thought I was alone. They said it would be quiet. That justice, when real, doesn't roar. But they didn't warn me about the silence after. 3 days after the guardianship hearing, I stood in my tiny kitchen, trying to open a jar of peanut butter with hands that hadn't stopped shaking. The apartment smelled like reheated takeout and anxiety. I hadn't slept. Not really. Ethan was home. Stable. Wrapped in his rocket blanket, sleeping on the pull-out bed beside mine. I should have felt peace. But the knock came at 9:27 a.m. 2 slow raps. I froze. A man in a gray jacket stood there. Certified letter for Jessica Morgan. His voice was polite, almost bored. I signed. He left. I didn't move for a long time. The envelope sat on the table like a trap. White. Crisp. Cold. I stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before peeling the seal. Emergency custody motion, filed by Bradley Morgan. Reason: alleged emotional instability. Attached a typed statement from Margaret. A few loose observations from unnamed sources. My knees didn't buckle, but I did sit. Slowly. So they were still trying. Even after the court order. Even after I proved I wasn't the unstable one. They were playing the long game. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat on the floor with my back against the fridge. I wrapped myself in one of the scratchy blankets from the hall closet and stared at the oven clock. 12:12, then 12:41, then 1:08. I didn't cry. But I thought about it. I thought about the way Margaret used to say, "She's a little dramatic, but she means well." Like that was a compliment. I thought about how Brad always called me sensitive. In front of other people, but never in a way that sounded like care. More like a diagnosis. And I thought about every moment I had let them talk over me, edit me, outvote me. I had been quiet for so long, I'd almost forgotten the sound of my own certainty. But now I had documents, and names, and witness statements, and truth. Julia met me at the office the next morning. Still in scrubs. I hadn't even had time to change. She took one look at the letter and said, "Well, they're sloppy. We filed the response in less than 36 hours. Motion to dismiss. Motion to investigate. Attached audio recordings. Staff testimony. Timeline charts." We walked into the courthouse like we had done it before, because we had. But this time I wore flats. No makeup, my hair in a simple bun. Not for them, for me. Because I didn't need to perform composure anymore. I owned it. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. Brad sat 2 rows up, beside Margaret. Chelsea sat alone, legs crossed, arms folded. Their lawyer began, "Your Honor, we present a case based on concern, not conflict." Julia didn't flinch. Didn't argue. She waited. Then she stood. "Let's allow their own words to speak." She pressed play on the video. The room filled with Margaret's voice. "If we can get her to crack, we'll take everything. One breakdown, that's all it takes." Then Brad's. "She's too close to this. Let's be honest, we were never planning for her to stay involved long term." No reaction at first. Just breath. A hush. The kind that makes your stomach clench. Then the judge raised a brow. He didn't look surprised. He looked done. "I've reviewed your documents," he said slowly, "and the behavior outlined by petitioners suggests manipulation of this court." He glanced over his glasses. "This is not just unsubstantiated, it is malicious." Brad's lawyer opened her mouth. The judge raised a hand. "Don't. I'm speaking." He turned to me. "Miss Morgan, your parental rights remain fully intact. Effective immediately, all prior motions are sealed. Any further attempts to circumvent these rulings will be referred to the DA's office for formal review." He paused. "You are your son's legal guardian. Period." The gavel hit the desk with a sound that echoed in my chest. Margaret gasped. Chelsea stood too quickly and nearly stumbled. Brad just sat there. Still. Staring at the floor like the whole world betrayed him. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. Outside, Julia offered me the stamped papers. I didn't reach for them immediately. I just stood there, breathing in the dry Salt Lake air. The sky was wide, open, unjudging. I asked her softly, "Is this what freedom feels like?" She smiled. "Not yet. But you're damn close." That evening, I brought home a small celebration. Frozen pizza. Root beer. Ethan's favorite flavor of cupcakes. Vanilla with too many sprinkles. He was waiting at the door. In socks. Still thin. Still tired. But smiling. "Did we win?" he asked. I nodded. Tried to say, "Yes," but the word caught in my throat. So instead, I opened the pizza box and said, "You pick your slice first." We watched a movie from the couch. Half asleep, he turned to me and whispered, "They can't take you away, right?" I kissed the top of his head. "No, baby. No one can." Later that night, while he slept, I opened my laptop, logged into stillstanding.org. This time, I didn't hesitate. I uploaded every part of the story I was allowed to share. The parts that didn't need names. Because the women reading already knew them. Within an hour, my inbox filled. One message said, "I left the hospital with nothing but discharge papers and doubt. You gave me hope." Another, "I didn't think anyone else had to fight for the right to mother." I didn't cry. But I let the messages sit on the screen. Felt the warmth behind the words. Felt the quiet validation. The apartment smelled like something baking. Even though nothing was in the oven. Just peace. Just warmth. Just breath. The light through our kitchen blinds changed that month. It didn't feel harsh anymore. It felt earned. Like peace finally had a place to land. Ethan had started sleeping through the night again. No heart monitors. No chart updates. Just the soft, steady rhythm of a child who felt safe. Each morning, he padded into the kitchen with socked feet, messy hair, and that stuffed rocket he still refused to part with. His first words weren't always, "Good morning," but often, "You're still here." And I always answered, "Of course I am." There was no custody battle left to fight. No hospital forms left to dispute. Just life. Quiet, ordinary, beautiful life. I returned to part-time work that fall. A few shifts at the clinic, just enough to keep me feeling tethered to who I was outside of motherhood. Ethan adjusted to his new school schedule, and I adjusted to the idea of rest. Still standing, org became more than a placeholder. It became a lifeline, first for me, then for others. I launched a Sunday audio series. Not dramatic, not angry, just letters. Dear mother who sat alone in the ICU. Dear woman who was told she's too much. Dear friend who stayed even when they called it weakness. I recorded them late at night, in my sweatshirt with tea cooling by my elbow and Ethan snoring softly in the next room. There was no script, just memory. By December, there were over 6,000 subscribers. Some wrote in paragraphs, others in just one line. This saved me. This was me. You put words to something I never could. We weren't a support group. We were proof that justice doesn't have to scream. That healing can be handwritten. That legacy isn't just what we leave behind. It's what we live, quietly, every day. One evening, while folding laundry, Ethan asked, "Do you still have the blanket from the hospital?" I nodded. He smiled. Good, that's our beginning. He didn't say battle, or pain, or trauma. He said beginning. That night, I sat on the floor beside the storage box labeled, "What We Survived." Inside, the first drawing he made of us. The court document with my name bolded. The nurse's thank you note. A single bandage wrapper from his first IV. And the audio recording that changed everything. I didn't press play. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in the file. It was in the choice to keep it. Or not. I slipped it back in. Closed the box. Then stood up. There's no certificate for what we do. No trophy for staying. No award for enduring silence with dignity. But there's something better. A child who knows they were never left. A self that knows it never disappeared. A voice that didn't crack, just paused. Then returned, steadier. Still Standing became a nonprofit by spring. We partnered with a trauma-informed legal firm. Created templates for emergency guardianship, built printable trackers, translated resources into Spanish, Korean, and Tagalog. Women from over 30 states wrote in. One said, "Your site helped me file on a Sunday with no lawyer and no fear." Another sent a photo of her and her daughter, smiling, wrapped in hospital blankets at home. That one stayed taped to my fridge. On Mother's Day, Ethan gave me a card he made at school. The cover was lopsided hearts. Inside, he'd written, "Thank you for choosing me," even when it was hard. I kept it in my wallet. I used to think closure meant an apology. A reckoning. A moment where they admitted they were wrong. But now I know better. Closure is standing in your own kitchen, drinking coffee you brewed yourself, while the sun pours through clean windows, and knowing that no one, not a judge, not an ex, not even a past version of you, gets to define what happens next. Margaret sent one more letter, just one. It was short, something about regret and misunderstandings, and, perhaps, one day, we can all sit at the same table again. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't always about rebuilding. Sometimes, it's just about not bleeding anymore. One Friday night, I tucked Ethan in after a story and asked, "Do you ever think about that time in the hospital?" He thought for a long moment. Then shook his head. "Not really. I just remember you were there the whole time." That was enough. If you've ever had to fight just to be heard, I see you. If they called you emotional, dramatic, or unstable for showing up, I hear you. If you stayed, through the silence, the chaos, the courtrooms, the nights where you doubted everything, you're not alone. Share your story below. Let other women know quiet justice is still justice, and healing is a legacy worth leaving. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of closure, healing, and empowerment after 40.